You're done with this?
Yeah.
So we can go.
Yeah.
Okay, we can go back on. It reversed.
Yeah. There you go.
How'd you do that?
Swap displays.
Okay, cool.
What's it? What's it? Swap displays? Let's just make
So
sure.
you're live now, Steve.
Alright.
We're actually live on the broadcast.
All right.
Okay. No, I just wanted you to know. Hey,
I have 1 second to double check something
Sure.
else.
what do you need?
Just make sure that's something else real quick.
For him.
No, I'm gonna use this mic. I'll use this. Yeah, make this one live, so I'll just make everybody's life easy. Okay. Thank you.
And then for Arun and those, they should ask them what they want. Arun is over there. Arun.
Okay. There you go. Sorry.
What's that?
Yep. Still works.
Yeah. Welcome to the third. Nope, we are live. We are.
We're not gonna take a break.
We're starting out with some introductory remarks. That's not going to, so people don't. And then we'll have the 16 presentation. Phonetic. He says say it phonetic. Yeah. Yes.
The man.
Yeah. Well, I was in Alaska last week. Oh, you were? Were you with Rich? Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I did not know, but I thought it was actually a good idea. So Sarah McCarthy was like, whoa. And I talked to some of the Alaskans,
Yeah.
and they said that, this national labs, this is about a national
Right.
lab in Alaska. The national lab just pull the solutions out there.
Right.
Nothing sticks.
Yeah.
I said, you guys need to do it back to Alaska.
Right.
Well, what? Rich is all
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, right. So I'm going actually tonight. Yeah. No, I'm going to Anchorage, Sucky.
Reach Fairbanks and check what time is sunset? 11:59.
Oh man.
Right, so we're going to get going. And for those people online, we're going to probably start in about 5 minutes. Okay.
Talking to them like it's the concert.
Well, they need to know what they're doing.
Want to go to dinner?
Yeah. Oh, no, I can't.
Oh, right. What time?
No, I kind of like late. Do you know if anybody's else? Oh, he's in route. So we're going to do him when? Arun? Hey, Steve. Tom, which order? Okay, that's the order we're going to take. All right, hey, Jeff. Jeff, we're going to do Steve, Tom. Yeah, Steve back. Yeah, yeah. I don't know, when do you want to go? What time is it? What time is it?
Sorry, the text wasn't clear. He's with the person passing the secretary.
Yeah, it's okay. We're going to, it's 10 or 15 minutes anyway. Should we get going? All right, we're going to get going. Hey, Pete. Others, have a seat. Hi. Is the mic on? Yep, good going. All right, welcome to the third Hacking for Defense presentations. Welcome, everyone. We have an interesting evening. We're first going to start off with Steve Blank and then a bunch of speakers, and then we're going to go straight into the 6 presentations. The presentations have some video, and there's also the teams up here presenting. After that, we'll have some final remarks, and I think we'll be done in like less than 2 hours. All right, so first, I'm happy to welcome Steve Blank, my co-instructor, one of the co-instructors in the class, who's going to tell you what this is all about for those of you who don't know. Steve?
Thanks, Steve. You know, the good news is that the Stanford keeps up with the buildings for the size of the class every year because they get nicer and bigger. For those of you online who can't see it, it's a 5,000 person auditorium we're in this year, completely filled with people watching the presentations. As you could tell, I was in marketing in my previous career. So I just thought I'd give those of you not familiar with the class, both here in the audience and online, a little context of both what the teams were doing, who they were doing it for, and why these presentations are different than any other final presentations you might have seen in demo days or Shark Tanks. And first, let me start with the goals of the class. You know, our first goal when we put together the class, and I'll explain a little later where this came from, but we had some pretty concrete goals. One was to teach students a lean innovation methodology. That is, how to actually move fast, break things, build minimum viable products, get out of the building, while they engage, most importantly, in a national public service. Our view from day one was when we started the class that this was not just a class, but a class that would scale across research universities in the country. And as you'll hear later, I think we're on the path to do that. Our second goal was to teach students something which they may not learn in their standard computer science curriculum or MBA curriculum, and that was about the nation's threats and security challenges, while for the first time ever working side by side with innovators inside the Department of Defense and the intelligence community, which by itself makes this a very rare class. And then the third goal was to familiarize students who, as you'll hear, most of them have no military background or career, about the military as a profession, its expertise, and its proper role in society. And I think from students who have no exposure to the military and probably will never have exposure again, this turns out to be a very enlightening set of interactions of different cultures mixing with each other and as we've seen and we'll see, learning to appreciate each other's skills and roles in the country. The teams got to pick from 18 problems given to us by the Department of Defense this year. And those 18 problems, and there were a couple pages of them, came from Special Operations Command, Navy Space and Warfare Systems Command, U.S. Forces Korea, MITRE, Navy Facilities, Army Corps of Engineers, Air Force Air Combat Commands. Out of this list, you know, the problems were how do we, what kind of accountability during evacuation, boat heads-up displays, etc. The teams picked 4 of them: accountability, high-sea hackers, what we call the duck curve for energy identifying objects, and U2 high-res video. And again, there were some more sets of problems as well, from the Air Force Research Lab, Marine Corps Warfighting Laboratory, Department of Energy, Army Corps of Engineers, Defense Acquisition University, Army Central Command, and Army Corps of Engineers. And again, out of this list, 2 more projects were picked: personal recovery, extended battery power for radios, and e-acquisition on contracting programs. And you're going to hear about these 6 teams and their journey. And let me explain a bit about how the class works. The problems all came from our DoD and intelligence community sponsors. The teams formed teams before class, picked one of the problems, and then every week, the teams got out of the classroom, got out of the building, got off the campus at times, and interviewed 10 to 15 stakeholders, beneficiaries, customers, warfighters, procurement people, etc., every week, and built what we would call the minimum viable product. Think of it as a kind of whatever would get them the most learning every week, whether it was a wireframe or a spreadsheet or a cardboard mock-up. And you'll hear their stories about testing those with those customers. The class was run as a flipped classroom. Our lectures were recorded and online, so they were watched as homework. But the homework, what traditionally would be homework, was actually their presentations, which they did in class in front of the teaching team. So they repeated this every week. They got out, learned something new, and then presented their learnings in front of the teaching team, who gave them, as one would describe, as a bit unfiltered comments and suggestions, sometimes delivered with a 2x4. They all learned a ton, and I think that's what you're going to see this week. And their journey was about learning and discovery. It wasn't about getting funding. It wasn't about, gee, why don't we make a pitch for a bunch of VCs? It's actually, did we actually understand the problem as given? Was it really a problem, or was it a symptom? And what was our journey for the last 10 weeks? So this presentation is actually called the Lessons Learned presentation on purpose. It's not a demo day, and it's not a Shark Tank. It's what's the teams learned in 10 weeks, and also what did their sponsors learn from the teams. One of the neat things about having teams go through this lean innovation process is that the information flow kind of goes both ways. Sometimes the sponsors are frustrated by the teams questioning their complete command of the problem, but other times that the sponsors are actually learning as the teams are learning by being able to talk to people or get out of the building in ways that the sponsors sometimes cannot, given where they sit in a hierarchy. And so the teams did this all by using the Lean Startup methodology. And I just want to remind everyone who's not familiar with Lean, it just simply has 3 parts. The Lean Startup says, look, why don't we take a problem and deconstruct it into a series of hypotheses? And we use the word hypotheses at Stanford because our students are paying a lot of money every year, but outside the school, that's actually called guesses. So why don't we break down all these problems into what are our assumptions or guesses on day 1? And we use something called the mission model canvas, which is just 9 boxes on a single piece of paper to kind of articulate what are the things we need to worry about. And all the way on the right, the first thing we need to worry about is who are we solving this problem for? Who are the beneficiaries and who are the stakeholders? I will tell you that the neat thing is on day 1, you're almost sure who you're solving the problem for, and by week 7 or 8, you've peeled the onion and you discover a whole new series of people that you have to deal with or solve or are involved in solving the problem. The next most important thing is what's called the value proposition, which is a fancy term for what product or service are you actually building for those beneficiaries and stakeholders. And then the teams went and solved and asked a whole set of other questions. That's nice if we could build the demo, but the goal of this class was not to teach teams how to make demos for the Department of Defense. They have more demos than anybody on the planet. What they're really interested in is how do we get to deployment? And deployment means how do we get stuff in the hands of people who need it in the field? That's radically different than just give me a great demo of how smart you are and how the tech works. And so in doing that, some of the teams actually got down and dirty and got out to the field and understood how these things are used and what would it take and how would it get funded, etc. And in the bottom right, mission achievement and success is how do we know when we're done? Who is it that we have to satisfy? And again, because it's the military and a hierarchy, almost always there's a whole set of people you need to ask is, well, are we solving the problem for the general who gets promoted, or the infantryman in the Humvee, or somebody else in an airplane? And that required some deep understanding of the problem and the system that it was in. I won't go through all 9 boxes, but I do want to point out that most students had no knowledge of the military, the problem they looked at, or the Department of Defense when they started. And I want you to appreciate when you're hearing presentations that sound like, gee, how many years have they been serving, that almost all of these are students who, again, have never been involved with the DoD. So once they framed the hypotheses, that is, once they kind of articulated what the problem is, they got out of the building and used a process called customer development to actually get out and start asking people, is this a problem? What do you think? You know, what really is the issue? And almost every team, in fact, every team, spoke to over 100 customers, beneficiaries, and stakeholders in 10 weeks. That is, this team of 6 spoke to over 600 people in the DoD and IC. 600 people. You know, I'm not sure when we build an aircraft carrier we talk to 600 people, except when we're talking to Congress about why it's over budget. But I won't go there. And they were building the products, not the products, but the learning incrementally and iteratively using agile engineering, building what we call MVPs, which is a fancy shorthand for minimum viable products. What would get us the most learning at that point in time? What do we need to show somebody to say, is this what you need, or is this, are we getting warm? Sometimes it's a spreadsheet, sometimes it was something people could hold in their hands, sometimes it was a policy paper. And these 3 steps, frame hypotheses, get out of the building and talk to people, and build minimum viable products, is the sum of what lean innovation is about, and you're going to see it in practice as a story from beginning to end. One of the things I want to emphasize is what the teams won't be doing today is tell you in a final presentation is, here's what geniuses we are today. What we want them to share is, here's our journey of how we got here today. Here's what we thought on day 1. Here's what we thought on week 3. Here's where we kind of did something called a pivot, which is a fancy word for we got it wrong, but gee, learning and failure are kind of integrated. And so we got it wrong. We understood we had a faulty hypothesis. So just like science, we had a hypothesis. We ran an experiment. We got some data, and we either modified our hypothesis, invalidated it, or luckily maybe validated it. And you'll see that learning process throughout. So that's the kind of what you're going to see today. I'm going to give you 2 minutes on context of how it started. We've been lucky enough to teach this class inside of Stanford's engineering school in the STVP department run by Tom Byers, who will be talking for a couple minutes as well. You know, Silicon Valley is known for being kind of the cradle of innovation and entrepreneurship, and we've been honored to actually have at Stanford the same cradle for innovation and entrepreneurship and education inside the engineering school. Tom has let us experiment with classes, and the first one he let us experiment with was in 2011. I had the crazy notion of, I don't think how to write a business plan is what we ought to be teaching entrepreneurs. So we came up as a capstone class. So we came up with a new class that had never existed before called the Lean Launchpad. Started here, literally ground zero. And what happened is literally the Week I ended the class, I got a call from the National Science Foundation who said, "We think you invented the scientific method for entrepreneurship. We want to adopt this as the front end to the US SBIR program." I'll fast forward through this, but basically today, this Stanford class is now taught in 81 universities by 100 instructors, put 1,500 teams of principal investigators, our country's top scientists and engineers, through the same class that we teach here at Stanford. We then had a request from the NIH to modify the class for life sciences, and so we prototyped the class at UCSF for therapeutics, diagnostics, devices, and digital health, and what's called I-Core is now also available at the National Institute of Health. 3 years ago, the National Security Agency also concluded they needed a faster track process for innovation and adopted the National Science Foundation I-Core as I-Core and NSA. But what's really interesting and where this class came from is Pete Newell, who's one of the instructors I'll introduce, and Joe Felter, who teaches here at Stanford on CSAC, who is on a leave of absence to be the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for South and Southeast Asia, were brainstorming about how we could use this methodology to actually do those three goals we talked about: teach lean innovation processes to students and create a sense of national service, but do this at scale. And so Pete, Joe, and I came up with this idea of Hacking for Defense with Tom Byers' support, yet again, at STVP. We've been lucky enough is that the class is now written into the National Defense Authorization Act. It's being taught at 11 universities, and it will double to 22 universities in the next year. And we've been doubly and triply lucky is that the Office of Naval Research and the Neptune program has sponsored this class at Stanford this year. But it's not just Hacking for Defense. I'd like to just 30 more seconds give you the context is Hacking for Defense is one of Hacking for what we call X classes, because the same time we started Hacking for Defense, we also taught here at Stanford with the State Department Hacking for Diplomacy with Professor Jeremy Weinstein. And that's scaled to other universities. Columbia University took this model and taught Hacking for Energy. Berkeley took it and taught Hacking for Nonprofits. They call Hacking for Impact. And in the next year, we're going to see Hacking for the Environment, Hacking for Oceans, and Hacking for Cities from other schools and Stanford as well. So with that, let me just remind you that teams were surrounded by a sponsor, a technical mentor, a series of advisors, military liaisons, support from DIUX here in the Valley and in other places. In fact, the teams had so much input at times they couldn't hear themselves think. The teaching team, that's me, Steve Blank. The person who didn't introduce himself was Steve Weinstein, who also co-teaches both the Lean Launchpad class and Hacking for Defense. Pete Newell, who U.S. Army Colonel, ran the Army's Rapid Equipping Force, and now a company in Silicon Valley doing essentially the same thing for the DoD called BMMT. And Jeff Decker had several tours as an Army Ranger in Iraq and Afghanistan, and worked at RAND and works in a mental health startup as well. And a series of course advisors that helped keep us on track. Arun Majumdar, who's the co-director of the Precourt Institute, director of ARPA-E, Sarah Lee Benson, also co-director of Precourt and director of GCEP, Tom Byers, my boss. Where's Tom? Yeah, thank you. Tom, my boss, who's a professor in the engineering school and the faculty director of STVP, and John Mitchell, who's just retired as the vice provost of teaching and learning at Stanford. And again, a series of military liaisons and our teaching assistants. And so with that, I want to thank the ONR, Northrop Grumman, for the event support and the reception that we all get to have after the presentations by Palantir. So let me introduce Tom, and Tom wants to say a couple words about the class as well. So Tom, thank you for making this possible.
So you're in for a treat if this is the first time you've come to one of these. As Steve mentioned, this is the third year of this course being offered, but there's some things about this particular year that make it super special. and I want to talk about that. There's some common elements, though, of all 3 years. One thing to take note, if this is your first time, is these students come from all majors and all levels of the university. They're not just engineering students or business students. They're not just graduate students. We even have some undergrads. So this is quite remarkable that it cuts across the entire university. And as a professor in the Department of Management, Science, and Engineering, I've been lucky to end up with the Dowd Chair in Entrepreneurship Education for the School of Engineering. So we offer a whole lot of courses in entrepreneurship and innovation. So does the business school. But there's very few that have such special elements as this. One is the enormous amount of resources being poured into a few dozen students. You saw that by just the graphics that Steve was talking about. The large teaching team and the mentors and the coaches, it's really incredible. And so what makes this year kind of special, or very special, is something that Steve alluded to, and that is the welcoming of the Office of Naval Research to the larger family that puts this on. That's Rich Carlin and his team. Hello, Rich. I hope you're watching back in DC. This has allowed us to take this course forward in some significant ways, again, alluded to by Steve, as it's being spread now across the country, especially to those schools that Rich and his team have already relationships with, and that is something called the Neptune schools. And I want to make sure I get that right. The Neptune is providing these funds to places like MIT and Purdue and ASU and the University of California, Davis, and of course the academies themselves to provide cutting-edge research to help our warfighters. But what's neat about this, of course, is that this is helping accelerate those novel inventions and improvements get accelerated into helping our men and women, just allow them to do their jobs better. So it is truly terrific to have Stanford with our entrepreneurship courses, combining with our long history of connections with the U.S. government. Everybody knows this, and you're about to, witness an icon here, that this is a continuum with this, but we want to particularly thank the Office of Naval Research for helping us make it possible. So without further ado, I'd like to bring up Steve to introduce our panelists. Thanks so much again for attending today, and get ready for a great show.
So before we go on with the teams, we have two incredible panelists that are going to come up and share some thoughts about the value of relationship between university and students and the Department of Defense and government. And these are folks who not just can talk about it, but have served their lives doing it. The first is Secretary George Shultz, who has a career and resume that I'd spend the next hour and a half reading, but I think he's the only one who's been, let's see, Secretary of Treasury, the Secretary, head of the Office of Management and Budget, let's see, Director of and President of Bechtel, but then Secretary of State as well for the United States. And we're honored to have him here on the faculty at Stanford as the Thomas and Susan Ford Distinguished Fellow. His work on the Schultz-Stevenson Task Force at Hoover Institute has a long-time collaboration with the Navy on energy and innovation issues. And the task force also has on it two retired four-star admirals, Gary Roughead, the former chief of naval operations, and Jim Ellis, who was the former head of the U.S. Strategic Command. And that gives Secretary Shultz a bird's eye view of all the developments and progress in Navy and energy over the last decade. And with him today will be Arun Majumdar, who was the head of ARPA-E, which was the director of the Advanced Research Project Agency for Energy from 2008 to 2012. And before that, he was VP of Energy for Google, where he created most of Google's energy technology initiatives, especially at the intersection of data, computing, and grid. So with that, let me bring up Arun and the secretary. Thank you.
Let me say right off the bat, I'm a Marine. And when I became director of the Office of Managed Budget, a guy named Mel Laird was Secretary of Defense. I said to him, Mel, we'll probably have our ins and outs from time to time, but let's make one thing clear. He said, what's that? What the commandant wants, the commandant gets. Semper Fi.
I was going to introduce you as a Marine, but I think you beat me to that. But let me just take this opportunity to thank lots of people: Steve Blank, Steve Weinstein, Pete Newell, Sally Benson, Tom Byers, John Mitchell, Bill Perry, and of course Jeff Decker, and the sponsors and the TAs and all the students who participated in this. This has been, I mean, I attended, I think, only one class, but that was eye-opening to me. But Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. If you step back from this particular course, I think there's a lot of interest in the Department of Defense on innovation. And you've been there on the highest levels of policymaking in Washington, and you've been in the heart of Silicon Valley. In fact, you often say that Silicon Valley is a spin-off from Stanford. Based on your experiences, what can the Department of Defense learn from Silicon Valley and vice versa?
Well, first of all, I would say I had a lump in my throat when I read that Google would no longer do any work for the Department of Defense. Who the hell do they think they are? Do they not realize that they exist because there's a Defense Department and people go out and fight and die to defend the security interests of this country? So anytime somebody says they won't do anything with the Defense Department, I say, get lost.
So what can the Department of Defense, I know that Secretary Ash Carter and before him Secretary Gates and now Secretary Mattis is very keen on the innovation side of it. What is it that Silicon Valley can offer broadly to the Department of Defense?
Well, when Jim Mattis was here, he was a wonderful colleague. I'd see his light on in his office. I'd go and sit down. We'd talk for half an hour or so. Just a tremendous man, with this, very able, read a lot, strategic in his thinking, and very devoted to the interests of his country. So Jim is a fantastic guy. But I would say that the innovative capacities that are present now probably exceed what's been so for a long while. We had a conference at Hoover last September, and Jim had a remote participation in it because he had great admiration for Sid Drell, to whom it was dedicated. Late Sid Drell was a physicist here and had his office at Hoover. But at this conference that Jim helped with, there was a man named T.X. Hamas. He's a retired Marine Corps colonel. He's at the National Defense University. And in his paper, he says, the combination of artificial intelligence and 3D printing is going to cause revolutionary changes. And you don't know how it's going to unfold. But for example, and I think artificial intelligence has been getting lots of publicity, but in the end, 3D printing may be at least as revolutionary. For example, it's going to be possible to produce more and more of the things you want near where you are. Think about that. That means industries that have moved to low-cost labor will wind up back here. It's deglobalization. That's very disturbing in many ways, but also means the productivity of our labor force will increase dramatically. But there are all kinds of implications for the military. For example, as I understand it now, ships, lots of naval ships have their own 3D printer aboard. And if a part breaks, they can make another one. They don't have to go back and abort a mission. It's all sorts of applications of this. But you have to think about it and realize what's possible, and then start your innovative process.
Well, when I look back in the history of innovation, especially in Silicon Valley, if you go back in history and you asked about where did the internet come from, the internet came from DARPA funding. And in fact, Google and Apple and none of these companies that are based on the internet would exist, as you said, without that funding and without the research that it enabled at the universities like Stanford and many others. If you look ahead now and ask the question, and I know you're a big fan of R&D, what is the R&D that the Department of Defense should be investing in that fosters the kind of innovation that will enable the Department of Defense and frankly create the new industries that we don't have today but will be the future?
Well, I don't know such a broad question, but I think in order to do the kind of job that our armed forces need to do, that our government needs to do for us, we have to have strength. In the Reagan period, our motto was peace through strength. Now, force is a means to an end. The end is strength. Let me give you an example that has nothing to do with innovation, but was in a sense a kind of innovative act. When President Reagan had, very shortly after he took office, the air traffic controllers struck. They had taken an oath of office. And he said, they took an oath of office, they violated it, they're out. And all around the world, people said, is the man crazy? These guys keep the planes flying. But he had as his Secretary of Transportation a man who had run a big transportation company, a chief executive, and he understood the problem. Working with the president, they manned the towers with management people. They had some military help. They had a very aggressive recruiting and training program, and they kept the planes flying. And all over the world, people said, hey, watch out, the guy plays for keeps. So strength is really important. And I remember at the start of World War II, I'm in Marine Corps boot camp. And I remember vividly the day the sergeant hands me my rifle. He says to me, take good care of this rifle. This is your best friend. And remember one thing, never point this rifle at anybody unless you're willing to pull the trigger. No empty threats. There's nothing Silicon Valley about that, but that's fundamental strength. If you threaten something and you don't come through, you have no strength. Nobody pay attention to you anymore. So this was a very fundamental lesson. I might say it's a broad lesson because if you're dealing with people and you carry out what you say you're going to carry out, then they trust you and they can deal with you. If you make a deal and you don't carry through on your part, they don't trust you. You can't make the deal. So trust is the coin of the realm. It's the reverse side of never point this rifle at anybody. So I think these are fundamental things you learn in the military that have broad applications to innovation and everything else.
Mr. Secretary, you have been deeply, deeply engaged in energy issues. You and Tom Stevenson have a task force, and you have emphasized innovation and breakthroughs in energy, game changers. If you make the connection to the Department of Defense for our national security, can you connect the dots for us on energy on one hand and security on the other?
Well, let me tell you a couple of stories. When I was Secretary of Labor back in 1969, I was made the chairman of a cabinet task force on the oil import control system. President Eisenhower, who knew something about security, thought that if we imported more than 20% of the oil we use, we're asking for trouble in our national security. So there was a quota system. and we're coming up against it. That's why the task force. So we had a very good group. We came out with a published report, and we made some very obvious points, such as most of the energy comes from the Middle East, so we ought to keep our imports down as much as possible. We should have some aggressive storage capacity, so in case something happens, we've got something to draw on, an insurance policy. And we should change the quota system to a tariff system, so we collect the rent, Saudi Arabia doesn't collect the rent. And we said, our task force has been in existence for a little while. We know more about energy than anybody else in the government. This is crazy. Energy is a strategic resource, and we ought to be paying attention. And so the president patted me on the head, said, thank you for the nice report. There were congressional hearings. Nothing happened. And I scratched my head. You know, you can make a strategic analysis, and it's simple and straightforward, but nothing happens. So a few years later, I'm Secretary of the Treasury, and here comes the Arab oil boycott. Pretty much what we predicted. All hell broke loose. A lot of electricity was produced by oil in those days. So Christmas lights were discouraged. Gas stations were closed on weekends. It was horrendous. And so our country was greatly affected, and the DOD was greatly affected directly. But what happened in that crisis was all of the things we had recommended got put into effect. And so I learned, if you want to get something to happen, sometimes it takes more than a good analysis. You've got to have something that shakes up the system. At the same time, if the moment comes when you can get something done and you aren't ready, nothing is likely to happen. So I think the R&D process is a process of getting ready. And lots of things are obvious and they get done, but probably it takes a jolt. For example, we have a book just published reporting on the conference where T.X. Hammes made his thing that I said. And a wonderful woman here at Stanford named Lucy Shapiro and her husband. She's a biologist, he's a physicist. And they wrote a paper. And among other things it said, as the climate warms, tropical diseases are coming north. That's predictable. We should be getting up our diagnostic and treatment capabilities. We learned a lot about editing genes. So we should get some of these mosquitoes and see if we can't fix them so they aren't as dangerous as they already are. Nothing is happening. It's not happening. It's a catastrophe waiting to happen. It's predictable. So can't somebody kick them in the pants? This isn't deep science. This is straightforward, obvious things to do.
Mr. Secretary, you've been in public service for decades. And as the students out here who are in the process of graduating, looking for careers, can you tell them, in your own thinking, the value of public service to the students out here?
Well, I've been supporting part of a group called With Honor, and I was supporting getting veterans to run for office with the idea that if you have served, you know something. It's like John McCain says, country first. You start thinking that way. And you also realize you're in a platoon or you're in a battalion or whatever you are, you realize you don't do anything alone. You have a team, and they have different capabilities, and they interact. And you learn that somebody has to give effective leadership, and you learn that somebody has to follow. And you learn all of these things. And then it become in a political situation, you're going to be constructive. You have your own fish to fry, of course, but still, in the end, you're going to be country first. So I think that's one of the things you learn almost inevitably, gets into your DNA. And it's the idea of service. So I think those of you who are thinking what to do next, consider the Marine Corps.
On that high note, thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your presence out here. Let's give him a big round of applause.
We'll play you the video first. Yep. Should we move the chair? Do you want to help him move the chair? Okay, Pete's got it.
Military operations are increasingly defined through information flow and situational awareness. Events which remain non-automated require significant commitment of time in order to collect and process information. Special Operations Command asked our team to mitigate a shortfall in automated capabilities during helicopter evacuations. Teams infiltrate via aircraft, execute a mission, and return. During the course of an operation, the number of aircraft and people change, yet perfect accountability needs to exist. Current methods require deliberate comparison of printed rosters while in environments which degrade sight and hearing. Our first hypothesis was that automatically counting personnel loading helicopters would prevent SOCOM from leaving anyone behind. However, commercial systems are heavy and require operators to actively interact with the tool rather than performing mission-essential actions. Finally, SOCOM does not leave people behind. Our sponsor's pain point is not personnel accountability, but excessive time costs. Planning requires manual data entry and paper manifests to track changes. We observed SOCOM's planning and execution process to find time-saving opportunities throughout an operation. Our minimum viable product integrates manifest planning, modification, and version control with automatic mustering utilizing existing Android-based equipment. We designed an Android interface to automate repetitive tasks and integrate with ATAC situational awareness mapping software. We allow mission planners to modify shared manifests during a mission, improving capability while reducing time costs. Our custom transmitter musters personnel using received signal strength and a rotating identifier. Coordinates are never transmitted, emissions are user controllable, and the transmitter weighs 30 grams with a 6-month battery life. Using this system, a SOCOM team employs an automatically manifesting, real-time representation of team member proximity to assign tactical team and aircraft, decreasing time costs in all phases of an operation, and during emergency evacuation, provides a rapid, actionable information flow while adding minimal equipment to the warfighter.
Good evening. My name is Dana Gingrich, and we are Team Track ID. As you could tell from our video, our problem scope has expanded and scaled throughout these last 10 weeks. Tonight we're going to talk to you about our journey and how we're helping Special Operations Command ensure accountability during complex operations. We started this problem thinking about the worst case scenario, an emergency exfil where teams are actively engaging the enemy, bounding back to aircraft, and getting on in a hurry while under enemy fire. During these types of scenarios, the only thing that matters is that no one gets left behind. And we knew to test this problem and to fully understand this, we would have to get out of the building. And over 10 weeks, we spoke with 96 different stakeholders as part of this problem, both users within Special Operations Command and technology and industry experts. We used the Lean Launchpad methodology to establish initial hypotheses. During week 0, with our given understanding of the problem, we scoped out what we thought our value proposition was going to be and who it was going to be useful for, who our key beneficiaries were. And then we set out to conduct our first interviews. So week 1, we sit down with our first operator for an interview and we ask, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much pain do you feel during these emergency exfil scenarios? His response, 0. In fact, it wasn't even on the scale. So we said, okay, maybe we need to expand our sample size. So we asked another operator, and his response, accountability really isn't a problem. So we said, okay, we're going to go to our sponsor, and we interviewed a troop sergeant major in our sponsor organization. And his response, we've never left anyone behind. And so after week one, we really had to go back to the whiteboard and sit down and think, how well do we really understand this initial problem?
So our second realization was that the real pain wasn't in accountability, but it was in the time and cognitive load that was required in order to gain and maintain that accountability. So it's important to realize that counting someone, it doesn't happen in isolation. A combat situation adds a significant amount of friction, and that friction includes nighttime. Night vision goggles reduce your visual acuity, they reduce your field of view, they wash out colors, it's difficult to see at night. When working with helicopters, helicopters include dust and significant noise. That makes it very, very difficult to hear, makes it difficult to talk, and in some cases, it makes it difficult to move around. Taking accountability is not the only thing that you're doing in that combat situation. You're also taking care of a tactical situation, talking to multiple people, and you're talking on multiple different radios. And at the same time, some of the people in your unit may not be all Americans, they may be local forces. They have different languages, different standards of training, different standard operating procedures. And at any point in an operation, you can add and subtract people to that mission. So our first minimum viable product was focused on the point of extract, getting people in and out of helicopters and automatically counting them. As people get in, red dots turn to green, and we thought this would be a pretty good way in order to automate the system. And we quickly found that it was insufficient.
So we took this minimal viable product to a couple of operators, and we said, how about a text solution? And we quickly realized that a text solution was not nearly sufficient to solve this problem, because there are a series of key user needs and user requirements that it was insufficient to address. The first was about durability. The current solution, the current methodology, doesn't ever run out of batteries. The second is around redundancy and the need to have paper with you so that it's very easy to understand what the alternatives might be. The third is that even if we introduce this text solution, operators were going to continue to do their work in exactly the same way. And finally, we heard if something does go wrong, the last thing I want to be doing is looking at a screen. In short, we heard that there was a cultural issue around technology. This sense that a really good operator, someone who was good at their job, would never need to rely on it, and therefore it would be insufficient to solve the real problem. So, they want a text solution? Not quite. What we heard is that there were a series of processes that we could help our sponsor organization do better and more efficiently.
And so, if our team's key value proposition is to help SOCOM with their current process, we first have to understand who is involved in the process and what their exact process is. So, a SOCOM team comprises of operators. These are the guys that blast open doors, take down bad guys, and do other really cool stuff. Then, the Troop Sergeant Major is the one who is in charge of the operational and organizational movement of the troops at the tactical level. And lastly, the officers or the ground force commanders are the ones who are overall in charge of the mission. They coordinate external assets, and they also report to higher HQ. So, through our customer discovery process, what we found was that more than half of a Troop Sergeant Major's time is actually spent on maintaining personnel accountability, more than half of his time. So, we found out that a Troop Sergeant Major is the sole person responsible for maintaining perfect personnel accountability at all phases in an operation. And therefore, the Troop Sergeant Major is our key beneficiary for our team. Maintaining perfect personnel accountability results in high cognitive stress for the Troop Sergeant Major, results in significant time cost in an operation, and all of this is while there are many other tasks that demand his attention at the same time. These problems are further aggravated when there are dynamic and complex changes to the operational plan. For example, in a bump plan, there's reallocation of personnel and changes in a type and number of mobility platforms for infiltration and exfiltration. The current tool for accountability is a piece of paper. This is physically printed before a mission. What this implies is that in the planning phase, there are version control problems. In an operation phase, it's hard to make changes on the go. And this is also used at night in low visibility conditions, which make it hard to see. Furthermore, changes to these plans have to be communicated over the radio, or the Troop Sergeant Major has to physically gather his team leaders for a briefing. This incurs time costs and interrupts their very precise workflow.
So once we identified our key beneficiary, we had to understand what his workflow was throughout the mission. So given our original problem statement, focusing on exfil, we wanted to start there. And what we realized is the Troop Sergeant Major is exfil. The reason the operators don't feel much pain on exfil is because the Troop Sergeant Major is actually gaining accountability before he ever calls the helicopters. And if the count is off, everything stops and the Troop Sergeant Major focuses on that specific task until it's solved before calling for exfil. Before that, during the execution phase, the Troop Sergeant Major isn't just thinking about exfil, he's also responsible for communicating with all of the operators on the ground, his higher headquarters, and ensuring that he knows the location of all key individuals within that target objective. Not only that, but he also has to think about casualties that could be leaving the battlefield or detainees, additional detainees that could be coming on that add to his count and weight based on his aircraft for exfiltration. Before that, infill gets complicated. Infill gets complicated because the operators will often come in on a different type of platform, whether it's helicopters, trucks, than they're leaving on, which requires two completely different plans and manifests, which adds additional stress to that Troop Sergeant Major. They may, the infiltration could range all the way from parachuting in, traveling 50 miles in the air, and that Troop Sergeant Major needs to ensure that he has accountability and gets to the objective on time. Now, this process could start minutes before they get the call, or the day or the night before in the planning process. During the planning process, that Troop Sergeant Major focuses on contingencies and version control. It's not just one plan. These Troop Sergeant Majors are sometimes coming up with 15 to 18 different plans. What those plans require is different versions, dissemination among all key stakeholders, and then printing out a physical copy to put in their pocket for the operation. This adds stress and sometimes has to be done within 15 minutes for time-sensitive targets. So the key takeaway for our key beneficiary is that it's not just about the 30 seconds at exfil. The Troop Sergeant Major is key throughout the entire process.
So a lot of our work focused on really understanding the Troop Sergeant Major's processes, and we built that into some of the lean launchpad tools that you mentioned with earlier, Steve. We built these kind of canvases that go into depth about what their priorities are, their pains, and we then began to design something against solving that. So what did we come up with? So we came up with a tech solution, but one that's baked into their existing ATAC system, which is a little Android system that the soldiers carry with them, and a set of sensors that communicate via Bluetooth and are plugged on each guy. That maps to all of the 4 stages of the mission. So in planning, remember, at the moment, they might have just a few minutes or perhaps even 15 minutes to prepare all these materials, work out the weights, how heavy is each helicopter going to be, who's going to go in which one. Our system automates all of that and makes it much simpler for them both speed up the planning process and bake in bump plans in case something goes wrong. Then when they're in the infill process, you can track across multiple platforms. So if some guys are parachuting in 50 miles, and some people are coming by land, and some people are coming by helicopter, you can track all of that. When you're on target, they need a system which can count in the detainees or casualties or anybody else that they need to shift around in case there's some kind of bump that has to happen because a helicopter's broken or something like that. And finally, when they're at exfil, they wanted something with clear visuals that said, yeah, you can go. So we built this, and it sounds fantastic. We were very pleased with ourselves. We didn't actually know if it worked. So we went down to Fort Bragg and had probably the coolest day of my life down there, testing it out. We tested all 4 stages of the process with them. So the planning and the infill and the execution and the exfil. So here's a photograph of Dana doing a great job of explaining what the planning tool would be like, and then these operators planned using that tool. They rehearsed on land platforms and also on helicopter platforms. So we saw them infilling, They trained rehearsing hitting up a target and then exfilling as well, and gave us feedback. The good news was that that feedback was actually really positive. In fact, it was so positive that when we were talking to people in the debrief, they said, look, even if you don't have the little sensors that track where everybody is, if you just have the very first phase, the planning phase, where I can automate loading up the different chalks and different helicopters and the weights, if you could just automate that and make it easier to export into PowerPoint, I'd use this right away, because that would save me a lot of time when I'm very time pressured and tired. So that's a pretty positive outcome for us. So what happens now? Well, as the professor said, we're not very interested in just doing the class and then letting it go. This is about deploying something that helps the troops on the ground. And the good news is that this unit has a lot of resources to do that. They have in-house developers, engineers, software engineers. Those engineers have the mandate to produce something like this. The technology we developed for them wasn't really very expensive. The chips, in fact, are $20 on Amazon. So this can be funded out of unit funds, doesn't need any kind of complicated acquisition process. And we hope that by working with the troop sergeant majors, who we think are the big beneficiaries and the big evangelists, that we can get it deployed. Because we noticed when we explained it, nobody listened very much. When the troop sergeant majors started speaking, everybody listened. So we think we've got a route to deploy in the unit. But moreover, there's a wider game here, which is about deploying to the rest of the Army. So the airborne divisions, the Navy SEALs, and other units. It's been a real privilege working on this team, fantastic colleagues in the group. We've had great support from the teaching team, our teaching assistants, our mentors, and particularly we'd really like to thank the organization we were working for, who gave us an amazing degree of access. It's been a fascinating experience. Thank you very much.
Yeah, our video is not loading for some reason at the moment, but we'll get it. That's fine. Yeah. It's not ideal, but it's okay. Yeah, no worries. Great. All right, awesome. All right, so So we're Team Polaris. So our original problem from the Air Force Research Laboratory stated to provide a way for downed pilots to keep critical electronics powered for 28 days. By conducting 106 interviews over the course of the last 10 weeks, we came to understand the problems of downed pilots and their rescuers, leading us to restate the problem. In a future threat environment, fewer downed pilots will be rescued because the C-cell radio is cumbersome, dies quickly, and provides limited situational awareness. As our problem evolved, it led us through a number of different hypotheses. Each of the steps you see up on the screen represents a minimum viable product, or an MVP. And some of these steps were small and incremental, while others were pivots, complete paradigm shifts in our approach. Today, we're going to walk you through our journey as a team over the last 10 weeks. Our morale started high, hit rock bottom around week 3, and peaked near the end of the course when we finally found an MVP that aircrew want today. Over our journey, we pivoted 3 times, taking 4 different approaches to try to address the problems of a downed pilot. Through power management, improved communications, power generation, and finally, an improved radio. We started with power management. We were extremely excited at the opportunity to save lives. And at first glance, this problem seemed incredibly straightforward. Just provide the pilots with a single large battery that lasts a month. At the outset, we didn't even know how long their current equipment lasted, but with all of the recent advances in battery technology, how hard could it be? We used a mission model canvas to frame our thinking and quickly realized just how little we knew. All that we could provide were guesses. What we want to highlight on this canvas today are the value proposition and the beneficiaries. What improvements were we providing and who was benefiting from them? At the outset, we thought that we should provide a big battery that lasts a month and that the people that would benefit were downed military pilots and their rescuers. We needed to test this hypothesis, so we built our first MVP. In this case, just a diagram of a big battery and power management solution to keep all of their critical electronics powered. To learn more about the problems of a downed pilot and to see if our MVP would address those problems, we went up to Travis Air Force Base. We talked to air crew and survival and evasion experts, and this is me doing push-ups in a survival vest. From our trip, we learned an awful lot. That battery is not the limiting factor in rescue operations, because almost always the pilot is picked up before battery becomes an issue. Instead, we learned that communication is a huge issue in personnel recovery, and that the primary objective is persistent communication. In particular, we learned that the C-cell radio is unreliable and cumbersome to use. This led us to our first pivot, to improved communications.
Our next hypothesis was that the C-cell radio was the bottleneck in rescue operations. We heard over and over that it was hard to use and it was very unreliable. So our next MVP was this diagram that showcased the different parts of the rescue operation. We had the downed pilot, our rescue center, that was the group of people that received the communication from a downed pilot, as well as other people that would go out, fly, and rescue the person. Our idea was that we could immediately get help to the person as soon as that person had to eject. This was confirmed by some of the interviews we conducted. This was our next MVP that evolved, and the idea here was that a pilot in distress would contact the rescue center as soon as there was any indication that he had to eject. Unfortunately, it's not all about time. In a 2014 RAND study that we read, the data showed that pilots in the current threat environment get rescued within hours. Even reducing the time to rescue significantly, say from 8 to 4 hours, that would be of very little help. That's when we hit rock bottom. Our morale completely crattered. We had no idea where to go. The idea of improving communications showed that we basically cannot provide any help there. Power management was a dead end. However, after extensive conversations with our sponsors, the teaching team, and our mentors, we arrived at the conclusion that a battery will be a problem against a future near-peer threat. This is when we moved into power generation. We already knew that power management and a single large battery would not improve the chances of survival for a downed pilot. However, we had a different hypothesis this time. The idea here was that power generation could be worth more than its weight in batteries. The idea here would be that any useful device would be able to generate more power over the course of an evasion than what a battery of similar weight and size would be able to hold. To test this out, we looked into several different possible devices. We looked into a solar panel, a stove that generated electricity from heat, as well as a hand crank. Unfortunately, fire is a non-starter in an evasion scenario. The light, heat, and smoke completely make evasion almost impossible. Similar considerations applied to the solar panel and the hand crank, which are respectively reflected light a lot, as well as the hand crank being very noisy. Another consideration was that none of these devices could actually generate the necessary amount of power. Carrying a battery of the same size and weight would provide more electrical power to the person. So we went back, looked at the problem. We had several ways to go forward. Did we miss anything in power generation or storage? We thought we hadn't missed anything. So our only path forward was to try to improve the radio. And this leads us to our final part of the journey.
When we kept hitting dead ends, we returned to what our users were telling us the whole time, which was that when they use the C-cell radio, it's heavy, it's cumbersome, sometimes it doesn't even establish a link at all, and also that the navigation and texting user interface is pretty bad. And so they're asking us, why am I relying on a device that was designed in the 90s when I have an iPhone in my other pocket? So this was our hypothesis that we developed and confirmed by a lot of those interviews that we were returning to. So our first thought was, could a radio modification address some of the down pilot needs, and the current pilot needs as well, the operators of the C-cell radio? And what we found was getting into the radio itself would be a huge technical and political challenge. What about just supplementing the radio? So we paid a visit to Somewhere Labs, a local startup in San Francisco, and they're creating a device currently which, when paired with your smartphone, could allow you to do satellite text just from your smartphone. And it's a small, rugged, durable, and lightweight device, which would be perfect for a downed pilot. James, the CEO, lent us one of the devices to take out in the field and to test and get user feedback on. So this became our new MVP. We knew that a lot of pilots often carry a smartphone, and we knew that they probably would be able to carry a combat configured smartphone that was secure. And so if you couple that with a UHF transceiver, you have a really powerful evasion, communication, and navigation tool. Hristo and Aiden went out to Travis Air Force Base to test this in an actual evasion and survival scenario, and they confirmed that hypothesis. This was a significant improvement to the navigational and evasion of the pilot on the previous devices. This is the actual map of the evasion that we participate in with key information highlighted. This is the kind of information that we believe should be provided to a downed pilot, and this is the kind of information that our MVP would be able to provide. The user feedback on this MVP was overwhelmingly positive. This appears to be a brilliant leap forward from a rescue pilot. In a survey of over 80 military pilots, the vast majority wanted this device now. So finally, in short, we'd found product mission fit, which felt great. So that's our little peek. Going back to our mission model canvas, we learned so much from our initial guesses. In the end, we had a strong value proposition to really well-defined beneficiaries. The remaining 2 weeks of the class were spent talking to acquisitions officers, program managers, and DOX to figure out, how could you actually get this thing deployed? And unfortunately and unsurprisingly, we figured out deployment's actually pretty hard and takes a long time. And the quarter's basically over. So where does that leave us now? In terms of next steps, based on everything that we've learned about the environment, Hristo and Aiden think that it doesn't present itself as like a compelling business opportunity. And we've also heard about other classified programs that are working on a similar project. And I myself believe that Hacking for Defense has uniquely positioned us to make a really large impact to pilots and other aircrew. And as a pilot myself, I'm really interested in this problem personally. And so I think there's still some more work to be done. None of this would have been possible without the support of so many people. And a special thanks goes out to Colonel Hasseltine, Kev Ray, Shrek, and Sergeant Norcom for going above and beyond to help our team. Thank you so much. I think we'll get a chance to show the video. We'll just show you our video right here in the reverse order.
An American pilot is shot down deep over enemy territory by a near-peer adversary. They eject from the aircraft and hit the ground at 11 feet per second, sustaining minor injuries. The pilot must immediately evade enemy forces closing in. They must find water within days and food within weeks. The rescue force is unable to exfiltrate the pilot for several weeks due to the high concentration of anti-aircraft weaponry. The pilot must be prepared for a long-term evasion. This situation is not without precedent. In 1972, Captain Roger Locker was shot down deep inside North Vietnam. He had to evade capture for 23 days and travel 12 miles undetected before his rescue. Captain Locker kept his radio turned off to conserve battery. While he could scavenge food and water, he only had as much power as the batteries he carried in his survival vest. This is the challenge the Air Force Research Laboratory posed: provide a way to keep the critical electronic devices powered for 28 days. The goal? To support a long-term evasion. The current survival equipment does not support such an invasion. This capability gap arises from the survival radio, which is the most critical and consumes the most energy. Aircrew today are equipped with the PRQ-7 Alpha or PRC-112 Gulf. The Department of Defense spent $250 million putting 60,000 of these devices in the hands of our warfighters. Despite the cost, these radios only provide 6 to 8 days of intermittent communication. Our team spent 10 weeks interviewing over 100 users, customers, and experts, including pilots, aircrew, rescue teams, SEER specialists, procurement officers, and technical experts in the military and commercial world. We explored a number of solutions, including managing power, improving communications, generating power, and finally improving the radio itself. We ultimately arrived at a commercial off-the-shelf solution that aircrew want today. This is our story.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We are Team Aquaforce. Our journey began by learning the Defense Acquisition System, which is the process by which the Department of Defense delivers systems that fulfill user needs. These include land systems, air systems, sea systems, information systems, space systems, and cost the Department of Defense over $250 billion per year. According to a Department of Defense acquisition study, major defense acquisitions programs can take an average of 7 years, from as little as 0.7 years in the case of the mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicle, to as long as 13.8 years for the Joint Strike Fighter. A GAO report dug into the process and found that programs spend an average of 2 years on up to 49 documents, and that the primary reason for this timeline is that large number of stakeholders involved. Enter Team Aquaforce. Sponsored by the Section 809 panel, our challenge was to enable acquisitions professionals to automatically develop and coordinate program documentation. By conducting extensive customer discovery, over 104 interviews, 70 survey responses, and visiting DIUX, In-Q-Tel, BMNT, and SPAWAR Systems Pacific, as well as San Francisco PD and Airspace, we discovered that communication and collaboration enable faster, higher quality program information at the creation layer, as well as faster, better program decisions at the approval layer. Short-term implementation reduces barriers to adoption by binding existing tools together into a unified workflow under policy. As a follow-on, a long-term platform solution can be developed, tested, and implemented according to best practices. As a result, we will enable program managers to make better, faster program decisions with fewer documents, making the overall acquisitions process better and faster as well.
Okay, great. Can everyone hear me? So for the past 10 weeks, we learned about the most dangerous problem facing the DoD right now. There's a lot of really cool work that's being done by our classmates, but if this problem that we're about to talk about, the acquisition system, doesn't get improved or reformed or frankly solved, not a lot of the solutions that they put forward will be able to make it in time to the warfighter. So our original problem statement from, we worked with Section 809, which is a congressionally put together panel of acquisition professionals from across the DoD who are looking to reform and make recommendations to Congress to reform the acquisitions process, was to enable acquisition professionals to automatically develop and coordinate program documentation. And I'll talk a little bit about how we went about that in a second. But first, I want to just bring this to a story that made this really resonate for me and emotionally why this is such an important issue. So this is a picture of a Marine in Afghanistan, and the significant thing about this picture is the story that I heard about how this Marine, except for the uniform on his back and the rifle that he carries, had to procure all of the equipment that he uses to fight the Taliban himself, because the acquisition process was not adequate for him. So at first we thought that it might just be an automation issue. The problem statement that Section 809 gave us was, help us enable acquisition professionals to automatically develop and coordinate program documentation related to a defense acquisition. We thought, well, this is actually quite straightforward. We have templating solutions out there. We have ML systems out there. This is something that our team has expertise in, and so it's something that we can approach. So in order to test this, we interviewed over 104 different stakeholders from across the DoD and across different acquisition professional capacities. And this was helped by the Lean Startup methodology that Steve went over and our other classmates. But we quickly realized that it was much more complicated than we originally thought. This is a visual that is technically no longer in use, but effectively still is. Section 809 wants us to focus on post-milestone B major defense acquisition programs in the defense acquisition system only. But through our interviews, we very quickly realized that we were getting pulled all over the map. So then we thought, okay, what are actually the core issues here at stake? What's actually the status quo? Well, the system is clearly too slow. The system has too much paperwork associated. The system doesn't utilize existing tools even within the DoD. A lot of the tools like SharePoint, different collaboration platforms aren't utilized as much as just email and what Mike likes to call SneakerNet, which is just walking over to someone's office. And it's really hard to know what information one even needs in order to make better program decisions. People kept on telling us, oh, we need to make better, faster decisions, but they couldn't even tell us what a better decision looked like. So our team's journey throughout the process kind of mirrors the map I showed you, in that we were pulled in a bunch of different directions in the beginning before finally settling on something that we thought was closer to product mission fit. So I'll walk through how we settled on this. For the first week, we tested the hypothesis that Section 809 gave us, which was document generation. But we were quickly pulled in the direction of, well, actually, wait a second. Is it actually document generation that causes the most issues, or is it the fact that it takes 3 months to get on a general's calendar and then that general could cancel a day of, which just delayed your program at least 3 months? So then what we did was we put together an MVP. It just was super lo-fi. It looked like this. In order to be able to test, to get an understanding from people, do they really think that this is a problem, or is this something that they just think is the problem and something else underlying is causing it? And so we found that actually, no, the problem really underlying all of this is risk aversion and uncertainty. So acquisition folks are afraid of making bad decisions or not seeing the risk that will ruin a program. Higher-ups tend to do a pocket veto, where they essentially pocket something so they don't have to take the risk of making a decision on it. People wouldn't even sign. Things would sit on officers' desks for 1 to 2 months because they didn't have time to look through everything, or they didn't trust the quality of the documentation that was being given to them. So again, we go back to this, sort of back to square one when we're thinking through, okay, what does it even mean to solve a risk aversion problem? And so I think this is the farthest that we went away from our sponsor's original problem, which I'm sure Shirley forgive us for all of our emails to you. But this just looks like it sucks. I mean, why would anyone want to go through this? And so then we thought, well, what are the other ways that people are trying to get around? So the alternative funding mechanisms. And we actually found there's quite a lot. So we got out of the building, we went to DIUX, we talked to BMNT, we went there, we talked with the Defense Digital Service, we went to In-Q-Tail, we went down to San Diego, we looked even at the OTA process, and I think these are all turned out to be really exciting at first, but essentially red herrings, because they're really great for these small programs potentially as they go through just needing to be sustained on R&D budget, but as soon as you get into any sort of widespread implementation or any of these longer, bigger programs, are kind of non-starters because they don't solve the gap between initial funding dollars and sustainment. What we also did was we started better understanding our beneficiaries. Our original problem statement talked about acquisition professionals, but all of these people are kind of like acquisition professionals. And so who were we really supposed to be looking at? Who is our key beneficiary? And this is where we sort of honed in on the program manager. The program manager is someone who is responsible for coordinating all these different stakeholders together and putting together and making sure that the program itself is successful. And if we wanted to be able to help them make better, faster decisions with fewer documents, then that person was really, the program manager was who we could focus on, because they're the person who can make the decision of whether or not to use a document or not in a program. So then we thought, what are actually the core issues really at stake? And we came up with a new problem statement that we started testing that we thought was closer to what the actual core issues that we found, which is to help enable program managers make better, faster program decisions with fewer documents. So in order to start testing this problem, we started asking people, what are the characteristics of successful programs? What are the best practices? And who do you think has really done this really well? And we started to see a lot of common trends. We saw that there were flexible requirements that actually reflect user needs. We saw that there was constant communication at every level. I can't stress how important this was and how surprising it was when we found that a lot of program officers don't call the operating units that they're actually designing this program for consistently over the 7 years on average that it takes to deliver a program. And no wonder when something actually ends up being delivered, it's not quite what people wanted. There's also this idea of program manager or program offices don't often have skin in the game, right? The best most successful programs are the ones that felt like were the acquisition officers who sit in the Pentagon, who aren't in the field, right? But they feel as though they're part of the mission. They get mission briefings. They have personal relationships with the people that they're helping. There's transparency through live updating dashboards. SOCOM does an excellent job at this, we found, in terms of having integrated dashboards, and it helps that, like mentioned previously, that they have IT teams that can help support this at every level. And finally, there's these social rewards for risk-taking and delivering product mission fit. Instead of just being delivered on or graded or rewarded based on delivering something on time and on schedule, there's also these social rewards for delivering something that actually fits user needs. And then finally, one of the most important things is just kill those bad programs, right? Like the successful programs can also be categorized by programs that did not take up a lot of money or a lot of time when they weren't actually going to be good fits. And there's frankly quite few of these examples within the DoD. So we also got this information in terms of in around week 3, week 4 from our interviewees that there was this communication gap. I talked a little bit about this, but basically that the teams are most successful, the ones that are in constant communication, the ones that feel part of the mission, and that lack of communication is really frustrating for our stakeholders. So that's why we added different stakeholders don't communicate consistently as part of our core problems in the status quo. So now we're at week 5. We found that risk aversion, uncertainty, and communication are core issues. Why is this a core issue, though? Well, it turns out this lack of communication seeds mistrust between communities. We started calling this the triangle of mistrust. These are all real quotes from our interviews talking about each other. These are just, we know it's actually not quite a triangle. It's actually much more complicated than that. There are a number of communities that don't really talk to each other, don't have relationships with each other, and don't trust each other, and that's what slows down a lot of these programs. So, we're getting into week 6. We think that we have a problem that's starting to get validation from our stakeholders in our interviews. So our final MVP goals going into week 6 were, 1, reduce the unnecessary documentation. Just get rid of documents that wouldn't support a program. 2, make sure you have something that already has a proven track record. It's essentially de-risked. 3, we want to automate where it makes sense, but not overly rely on technology. We also want to use existing implemented technology like SharePoint, like Microsoft Office, like Merck within the DoD. And then finally, it addresses sort of this lack of mistrust, lack of communication, and lack of, quite frankly, knowledge about best practices throughout the DoD. So that's why we came up with a policy process technology solution that we think would fit all of those things. And so then we started testing our MVP. This is how we initially characterized it before we built anything in software. But essentially you have 4 layers. You have layers of creation, where you can use templates or automatically generate documentation from databases. These databases do exist, or one at least did exist within from 2000 to 2009. We're happy to talk about it for. It's really great and quite complicated, but it worked. It actually produced the requirements documents for the LPD 17 automatically. It reduces also the number of documents necessary by encouraging tailoring the DoD 5000, which is something that SOCOM did. The second layer, collaboration. So by using a common document repository and knowledge wiki, you can build these in SharePoint. These are existing tools that the DoD already has licenses for. Communication is the second to top layer. We really actually think that real-time chat, it sounds kind of silly, but there are mechanisms in place now for enabling real-time chat within organizations that aren't just email, which is much more asynchronous. And then finally, a dashboard that enables program visibility at all levels and services the information that is actually useful for making good decisions. We use tools like value proposition canvases. I won't go into this one, but this is an example of something that we built for the program managers. And then by week 7 and 9, what we wanted to do is start getting validation that this was the right thing that we needed to build and recommend in our report to Section 9, which would go to Congress. So we started getting further validation for this from surveys. You have this idea of Slack, this idea of communication, of acceptance. There's a lack of acceptance of new technologies, so we want to work with existing tools. There's a lot of unnecessary documentation. So if you look back at our journey, we kind of went a little bit snaking, but we're finally hitting week 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, the same consistent feedback, which meant that to us that we found product mission fit. And really great is that from a component acquisition executive, we won't name who, but told us that we had the right vision, which was really encouraging. So I want to demo what we built. And before I jump into this, I want to walk you what we're going to do is walk you through 3 use cases of a potential any number of integrations between SharePoint features, Microsoft Outlook, and Merck or Slack. We built it this week within a number of hours, essentially. And we're going to deliver documentation on how any team can spin this up within a day, so within 24 hours, with existing tools. There's no need to acquire something in order to implement this today. For the first demo, so what we're doing here is we're uploading template documents, storing it in SharePoint. This is something that the DoD already has a license for. And then the user can then go ahead and download those templates if they really want to as well. It also creates a task which is highlighted here, and then that automatically sends a Slack notification to any channel. This can also be done through Merck, which is a tool that's already approved for operations within the DoD. So for the second, might have to escape and go back out. Hold on. So for the second demo, we have the second use case, which is anyone can update a wiki with best practices. And so this wiki is already supported within SharePoint again. And this is just us randomly adding something. Anyone can add to this, and anyone can share these best practices throughout the organization. And then for the final use case, we have 3 different integrations. We have a Microsoft Outlook where anyone can send an email. That email will then populate within SharePoint itself. So you see that there's a task that gets sent for the APB. That task then gets populated in the correct place in SharePoint, which anyone can sort of follow or share, so you get notifications based on that. So that's just pulling up the task. And then once again, we'll show that this automatically populates into a Slack channel that anyone can follow, or a Merck channel that anyone could follow within the DoD. And these are just, I mean, these use cases, I want to stress, these aren't the only use cases you can do. You can think of any sort of integration that you can think of. It probably can work in some way within these three different points that we shared. Okay. So, final thoughts. What we didn't want to do was we didn't want to ossify this or codify this into software, right? taking it back to where we started, what we wanted to do was figure out a way to create a system that helps the individual warfighter at the end of the day. So the bottom line is, our whole thesis is that what we need is a Darwinian DoD. We need a DoD that can evolve to the next threats, because it's not something that I think that we can anticipate necessarily. But what ended up happening was we were asked to do something within a paradigm that we ourselves started to question was even relevant anymore. We didn't want to ossify the current system to software, because in our belief, stagnant systems are vulnerable systems. Instead, what we wanted to do was enable the feedback loops that help the system itself learn or evolve. And that's why we've placed so much emphasis on an MVP that actually helps people communicate better, an MVP that helps share knowledge, not something that necessarily will spit out automated documentation based on an old process that probably wouldn't work very well. So our next steps are, we're going to submit this recommendation to Congress, or to Section 809, which we'll then submit to Congress, and then we'll be able to also give the prototype of an integrated knowledge base, program dashboard, and real-time communication tool to Navy acquisition leadership. Anyone who wants the prototype information, we can also give that to, as well as the recommendation. And of course, we couldn't do it without all the help from our mentors, from the teaching team, from the TAs, from everyone here, and all of these organizations that also supported. Thank you so much.
We're Team Intel Grids, and we initially were challenged by NAVFAC XWIC to solve the duck curve through a shared partnership with local utilities and domestic Navy and Marine Corps bases. NAVFAC, or Naval Facilities Engineering Command, is the command within the Department of the Navy responsible for overseeing on-land facilities engineering and management for 71 Navy and 24 Marine Corps bases worldwide. This includes everything from construction to maintenance and to ongoing support for these bases. In essence, getting things built and keeping the lights on. Within NAVFAC, XWIC is short for Expeditionary Warfare Center, a subcommand whose role focuses on providing specialized engineering and solutions related to expeditionary equipment specifically. NAVFAC XWIC charged us with helping them find a solution to risks caused by what is known as the duck curve phenomenon. But what is the duck curve anyways? The duck curve is the result of heavy solar power integration in the grid. On an average day, consumption, or load, on the grid varies by time of day. When solar power is added, it generates large quantities of energy during the middle of the day when the sun is shining, reducing net demand for energy and potentially over-generating relative to load, resulting in wasted energy known as curtailment. When the sun sets, however, the system must compensate aggressively for both rising load and falling solar generation, forcing traditional generation to ramp up substantially to compensate, resulting in technical challenges and increasing system costs. Given the need to constantly match load with demand, some assets like coal and nuclear plants need to be shut off or turned on at higher speeds than what they are designed for, thus threatening the reliability and stability of the grid. These twin problems of curtailment and aggressive ramping compose the duck curve, which gets its name from the effect of the load curve looking like the back of a duck. Sort of. As a team, we set off to better understand this problem and the challenges it would represent for the Navy. While we, like many cutting-edge technologists around the world, started with a more technical approach, we ended up realizing we needed something first: communication. Here is our journey.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're Team Intel Grids, and we're here to talk to you today about our work with NAVFAC XWIC to resolve the duck curve phenomenon. We were originally tasked by XWIC to help them solve the duck curve in the context of developing a system or solution to enable the local base to work with their local utility to ensure consistent, reliable supply of electricity and a reduced risk of outages throughout the day. Over time, however, and across 101 interviews, what we came to realize was that the answer was not to add a new technical solution on top of what was already a fragmented and complicated relationship, but was to instead focus on something more subtle,
ensuring communication and incentivizing that communication between on-base energy and utility personnel, as well as their local electricity partners, to allow an ability to understand risks to the grid, potential opportunities for mutual collaboration, and areas for future better understanding. So over the course of this process, we performed more than 100 interviews with a range of different stakeholders. These were people, for instance, in the Department of the Navy senior staff, all the way on down to individual on-base energy and utility managers, with a range of academics, industry folks, technologists, and regulators in between. During that time, we also went through a whopping 7 different iterations of our MVP as we discovered ever more complex and difficult and intractable issues along the way. Last but not least, we're also able to see some of these technologies and some of these issues in the field on the current day-to-day basis, with trips both to Travis Air Force Base and the SESI facility here on campus. You can see some of this evolution when you take a look at our mission model canvases and the changes therein. Throughout the process, at the beginning, we thought our key beneficiary was the base as a singular holistic entity. Over time, however, we realized that the true beneficiary of improved energy reliability and efficiency was actually the guys on the ground, the utility base energy and utility managers. These are the people that were dealing with this problem on a day-to-day basis. At the same time, our value proposition throughout the process didn't really change at its core. And increased efficiency, resiliency, and reliability were at the heart of what we were offering. However, with our final MVP, what we were also able to offer was the opportunity for a positive feedback cycle, enabling the utility and the base to come together to find better opportunities to not only solve the current status quo, but improve off of it. So we've talked a lot about deployments of technologies in the field, of soldiers, of ships, and all kinds of things happening abroad. But what most people don't think about when they think about the armed forces is actually the bases back here in the United States. However, these bases are actually really critical to our ongoing success in the field. And this is because of 3 primary reasons. The first is training and readiness. They train new recruits. They also provide a chance to disseminate information to units that will go back out into the field. They're also critical from a logistics standpoint, providing the ammunition, materiel, and fuel to our forces in the field. But last, but certainly not least, however, they are also critical in supporting ongoing operations. This is everything from command and control capability to autonomous vehicle operation, and as well as intelligence fusion and a range of other areas. In short, this means that if reliable electricity becomes a risk to these bases, it not only is a pain, it is in fact a direct risk to the success of our operations in the field and lives in the field. As such, it's a really, really important subject that draws a huge amount of attention from stakeholders, not just on base, but also from tenant commands, who have a range of issues that all vary from different bases based on the differing mission profiles at each.
So as Tom mentioned, our initial mission began with an opportunity to facilitate a partnership between military bases and their utilities, where military bases would offer up the use of their large-scale industrial loads to the utility so that they could essentially fine-tune the shape of that duck curve that you guys saw the drawing of. Now, the challenge here is that the scale of loads that's actually necessary to participate really well in these load shaping programs is quite significant, and the cost savings that actually come as a result of them are on the scale of a few $1,000s, so quite insignificant. And unfortunately, there's cybersecurity risks associated with flexible loads on military bases as well. So we quickly pivoted towards a larger scale cost-based solution in the form of a tariff that we dubbed the duck curve tariff. This duck curve tariff sought to essentially move energy usage away from that steep evening ramp and towards times that are much easier for the grid to use. This sounded like a great solution, and it was cost-based, and it involved military bases from across the state and country. But the challenge here was the slow legislation process moved about as quickly as a group of graduate students told to walk away from a table full of free food. So at this point, we had about 40 interviews, and we'd received validation a number of times that really you can't change what you don't measure. So a smart metering program seems like the best way to essentially come at this problem from a knowledge-based standpoint. So we moved towards a metering platform, and this metering platform sounded great, but once again, we found that the data is necessary but not sufficient, and that people weren't necessarily using this data
in the analysis or actionable point of view, so we pivoted towards a knowledge sharing platform. And these are 4 back-to-back-to-back pivots where our entire MVP had changed. So after 4 weeks of pivoting, we started to feel a bit whiplashed and realized that we needed to take a step back to really start to understand what we'd learned over the course of these interviews in the last couple weeks. What we found is some serious contradictions in what people had told us from different branches of the DoD. We had some people still guaranteeing us that the duck curve was really about reliability and that there was a huge energy security risk to the grid as a whole. Meanwhile, there were other people telling us that reliability wasn't really a problem because power systems engineers are really good at their job and really good at keeping the lights on, and that this was really just about the added cost that might come from future solutions looking at how to essentially manage this problem on the grid. Another contradiction that was really fun was that this really is about cost-based solutions, whereas other people are saying that pricing only really matters when people pay attention to it. This is specifically in the case of energy when most people don't think too much about how much they pay per kilowatt hour, whereas the price of gasoline is a constant conversation. And finally, when our confusion reached its max, we regressed to this point of trying to understand what we dubbed the yell chain, which essentially means, okay, if you can't figure out what's going on, figure out who's getting yelled at when things go wrong. And I'm sure that none of you will be surprised to find out that there was a different person who gets yelled at when the lights go out versus when things get, when there's overspending that takes place. So what this means is that you have some people working to purchase new equipment that guarantees energy security, while other people are working to essentially not purchase those exact same things to make sure that budget is made every quarter. So at this point, we had to take a huge step back. And we said, okay, let's just map out everyone who we've talked to and what we've learned. So what you're seeing here from the left to the right is essentially the people whose direct motivations our challenge stood behind, so the beneficiaries of our problem. And then moving to the right, what exactly it is they care about, why they care so much about it, how our solution maps into that space, and essentially what pains that we're actually solving for these beneficiaries. And from this map and the discussion surrounding it, we found that there's really one key tool that underlies almost all the issues that are being addressed here, and that's communication.
After this, we pivoted toward an inter-based meeting and guidelines in order to enable this communication and this knowledge sharing. However, we discovered there was an outage on a major base due to solar overgeneration and a miscommunication with the utility. So we decided to finally pivot to utility and on-base communication. Our next MVP was a utility-based roadmap that could enable energy managers to improve on this. However, we learned that while they were not experts on the matter, they were already maxed out on training hours, so it would be difficult to implement. We then moved to a base utility communication checklist that would be more easily implemented. We then discovered there was already an existing prep audit, which was a checklist that energy managers already had to fill in. So we felt like this would match our MVP really well and decided to interview the people in charge of the prep audit. Once we did this, we got validation for our MVP, and as Ali will explain you later, implementation in the future.
So our final MVP leverages existing systems within NAVFAC that are meant to both monitor and support best management practices within the Public Works Division. The PREP audit is an existing system which is a self-assessment completed annually by a public works officer, and the audit score is then used to track areas of growth within NAVFAC. That same office creates about 25 business management system guides, which are used to outline requirements for conducting business within public works divisions. So our final MVP modifies both the PREP guide, the PREP audit, and the relevant BMS guides to include best management practices surrounding utility-based communication. And we're currently in conversation with NAVFAC LANT, who controls these, to create a modified draft. And so in addition to NAVFAC headquarters and NAVFAC LANT, who need to approve and update the PREP audit and BMS guides, the key stakeholders that need to participate in our MVP are on-base public works officers as well as their utility representatives. So both of these parties need to invest the time in face-to-face meetings as well as pre-planning data gathering, and other tasks. And the value proposition from our MVP for those two parties are streamlined implementation and identification of new projects, as well as potential prevention of future issues such as outages. And for NAVFAC as a whole, our MVP strengthens their energy security framework pillars by providing an ecosystem in which reliable, resilient, efficient energy projects can be deployed more quickly. As a utility VP told us, you can't implement technical solutions to the duck curve, such as demand response, without a good basis of communication. As an example of that, researchers at NAVFAC XWIC, our sponsor organization, were attempting to pilot a wave energy project in Kaneohe, Hawaii, with some hesitation from the utility. Early on, NAVFAC decided to sit down with their utility representatives to discuss. At that meeting, NAVFAC was able to understand the utility's concerns for distributed generation in that region, as well as assure the utility of the small scale of the project. As NAVFAC told us, we were able to save hundreds of thousands of dollars and avoid years of back and forth by sitting down with them early. Through our MVP, we hope to encourage early and frequent communication like this across other Navy energy projects. As you can see from our journey, we started with a technical solution to a technical problem and found along the way that there were broader issues to address first. We're very grateful for all of the support that we've had over the course of untangling this web of a problem. Thanks a lot.
When the USS Fitzgerald was involved in a deadly collision on June 17, 2017, many initial reports considered cyber attack to be a culprit of the incident. While naval investigations eventually identified causes unrelated to a cyber attack, the DoD started asking the important question: how vulnerable are our military assets to cyber attack? MITRE's original problem statement to our team, C++, was, find a way for test engineers to conduct adequate cyber testing safely in order to protect a ship's navigational systems against hackers. After weeks of trying to find cyber test engineers, we came to the realization that there is no integrated post-acquisition cyber testing that occurs on naval vessels. This is due to two factors. First, the organizational structure of the Navy, and second, the lack of understanding and awareness of cyber threats by decision makers. For this reason, we identified the latter as the most critical problem and identified methods to empower commanding officers to make informed decisions in mitigating risks of their vessel to cyber attack. Our solution is Mission Critical, which is a web application that organizes information about cyber vulnerabilities in terms of its mission impact potential. Mission Critical presents ship-wide cybersecurity data to the commanding officer in their language, the Operational Risk Management Framework. A commanding officer will be able to see the overall cybersecurity risk of their missions, and then can select to view vulnerabilities organized by the systems affected. Finally, they can assign the remediation of certain vulnerabilities to onboard or offboard professionals to improve the cybersecurity of their ship and continue with their scheduled missions. The framework for hacking for defense has allowed us to transform MITRE's problem statement into Mission Critical, a tool to help commanding officers make informed decisions about the cybersecurity of their ships.
Good evening. My name is Scott Pratz. This is Ruben Kruger, Melinda Sun, and Ross Evald, and we are Team C++. So throughout the quarter, we worked with ONR, and we also worked with MITRE to solve the problem of test engineers need a way to test ships adequately and safely. And throughout the quarter, we conducted 99 different interviews with multiple cybersecurity and industry professionals to come to the new problem statement that commanding officers needed the ability to understand the vulnerabilities and how they relate to their missions. So throughout the last couple of years, you've probably heard about many of the naval mishaps that have happened. And as soon as any of these events happen, you can always see hundreds of articles that are generated throughout the internet that talk about cybersecurity as potentially being a cause of these mishaps. Now, thankfully, cybersecurity has not yet been targeted on these ships. However, the generation of all of these different articles and these headlines probably indicates that there's something going on in the naval community that indicates that cybersecurity needs to be looked at as a potential avenue of attack. This is because mostly the ships are extremely integrated. A carrier strike group has every single thing in that entire carrier strike group is talking to each other, from the engine all the way up to the radar system to the navigation system. They're all talking. They're all able to be accessed through different avenues of attack. And these ships were all developed in an acquisitions process that the requirements were generated 40 years ago, which means that these ships were not created and not planned to be in an environment that is extremely cyber threatening. So these ships are one of the major pain points that the Navy has to overcome, and they have to identify vulnerabilities in a way that is meaningful to operators. So we interviewed many different people throughout the process. We interviewed about 35 civilian government professionals that are operating either as contractors or as government employees. We interviewed active duty military, and a small fraction of that active duty military were our beneficiaries, who we ended up classifying them as commanding officers or operators of ships who make high-level decisions. And then we also interviewed industry professionals such as cybersecurity companies, Fathom 5, Exabeam, stuff like that. Throughout weeks 1 to 3, we were trying to understand a very complex problem. The space is huge. It's new. There's not a lot of expertise out there. There's not a lot of expertise in the Navy. And there are words like safely and adequately that no one really has a firm understanding of what they mean. And as people who come into this question of how do we improve cybersecurity, understanding safety and adequate and how they are quantified is really important. So in our initial couple of weeks, we decided that what a lot of our cyber engineers were saying was, hey, I want to conduct these tests on these ships, but the captains have a conflict of interest where they say, like, our ship is fine. Why are we going to let these guys come onto our ship, start toying with stuff, start messing around, leave our ship, and then we're going to go out and carry out operations, and who knows what's going to happen? Who knows what these guys are doing? I don't understand it as a captain. Let's just push it to the side, and let's just fix my engine and not worry about cyber. So this is our early mission model canvas. It's grayed out because it's changed so much throughout the process. But two of the things that we really want to describe here are the value proposition and the beneficiaries that we took on at a very early time. We initially started with the captain and the cyber testing engineers as our major beneficiaries. We wanted to develop a product that was able to develop testing procedures that targeted individual systems, could streamline testing process, and can be incremental aggressiveness so that a commanding officer is able to provide his input and the cyber tester is able to acknowledge the input and the safety concerns that the commanding officer have, as well as develop a testing methodology that can be carried out to meet the needs of the engineer. So this was our week 1 MVP. It was an idea that, hey, before we even start testing, we need to create a tool that the commanding officer can use that the cyber engineer can use. The commanding officer's safety concerns are provided to the tool. The cyber engineer uses this tool and says, okay, my captain doesn't want me to shut the ship down. I need to figure out how do I design a testing methodology that doesn't shut the ship down, but it enables me to test all of the equipment that I need to test for my requirements. And then it spits out a cyber testing methodology, and then that testing methodology is able to improve the cybersecurity of the ship.
So while we were conducting interviews, what we were trying to do is find people who tested the integrated system of a ship as a whole and show them our MVP so that we could get some feedback. And while we were able to talk to people who were testing individual pieces of equipment and isolated systems, we weren't actually able to find anybody who was testing integrated systems or the entire ship. And later we realized that the reason why it was so hard to find these integrated systems testers is because they didn't actually exist. And so we had a major pivot as a result of this finding. Instead of going from improving the current methodology used to test the entire ship as a whole, we went from that to trying to make sure that integrated ship systems testing was occurring in the first place. So in hindsight, the interviews that we were doing in the first few weeks actually looked something like this. We talked to somebody at each of these different naval command system commands, and they pointed us to someone else who they thought whom they thought actually carried out the integrated systems testing. And each time we performed an interview, we were directed to someone else whom the person we interviewed thought was responsible for integrated systems testing, only to realize that they actually didn't take responsibility for that at all. And so this was obviously an incredibly confusing process for us. And so from weeks 4 to 7, we decided to focus on asking the question, why doesn't the integrated systems testing occur in the post-acquisitions process? And this became a period of great confusion, particularly in terms of identifying our beneficiaries and figuring out whom we're trying to serve and what they want. And so we talked to a variety of different interviewees. People in R&D were telling us that testing was occurring for particular reasons. We talked to test engineers, we talked to government officials, and pretty much each week as we talked to each one of these beneficiaries, we created a corresponding MVP. And so we pivoted pretty much every week during this period because we weren't sure what people wanted, and each time we talked to a different beneficiary, we received a different reason why testing wasn't actually occurring. And so this was really confusing for us because of the amount of times that we changed beneficiaries. But ultimately, we realized that the problem that was the greatest reason why testing of an integrated ship system wasn't occurring was organizational. Namely, the way that the Navy is organized is not conducive to the testing of the entire ship. Rather, we found that during the acquisitions process, when the Navy was trying to acquire equipment to assemble onto the ship, there was individual testing done, and in the post-acquisitions process, the contractors that were responsible for a particular piece of equipment or system were taking that system, isolating it, and testing it in a lab environment. But no actual testing was occurring because there is no one entity that owns all of the equipment on the entire ship or is responsible for the cyber testing of all of the equipment on the entire ship. So we figured that one idea that we could do is reorganize the Navy. Now, obviously, this is an incredibly difficult thing to do. We considered a top-down approach in which we would create an office within the Navy that would be tasked with testing everything on the ship. But ultimately, we realized that this was infeasible, incredibly difficult, and out of the scope of this problem. And so we decided to take a bottom-up approach, focusing specifically on the commander. We understand that commanders have the power, if they consider cyber to be a real threat, to seek help from other agencies in order to patch up those cyber issues. And so we decided that rather than focusing on the top-down approach, we would focus on a bottom-up approach that empowered that empowers commanding officers to take action on cyber issues that they see as very critical to ensuring the security of the ship.
So with this new potential beneficiary in mind, during weeks 8 through 10, we wanted to answer the question of what a commanding officer needs to know about the cybersecurity on their ship, with the understanding that if they know what's wrong, they will actually take action to fix it. So the first thing we found out is that to many commanding officers, a threat that is cyber-related is not as real to them as a threat like a missile. So to address this, we wanted to make our MVP as concrete as possible to raise the risk of cyber to the same level of threat that something like a missile enjoys. And to do so, we use the operational risk management framework, utilizing that to convey cyber risk in the same way that risks that are traditional or conventionally conveyed to operational commanders. The second thing that we heard is that Everything is understood by commanding officers in terms of mission impact, and they just want their mission-critical equipment to work. So with this in mind, we wanted to make sure our MVP was essential and only conveyed the information that was absolutely necessary to know about vulnerabilities and mission impact. Lastly, we heard that it's depressing to hear that your ship is incredibly vulnerable. Sometimes test engineers will give the commanding officer a list of vulnerabilities in the level of thousands. So we wanted to make sure that we met their need to remediate cyber vulnerabilities. So the third thing that we want our MVP to be is actionable. So for every vulnerability that we list on the platform, we want to give a clear path for remediation. So this is our mission model canvas for week 10, and we've changed a lot. We originally thought our beneficiary was the test engineer. We were wrong. It's the operational commander and the commanding officer of a ship. And our MVP provides two areas of value. First, we want to facilitate understanding of cyber vulnerabilities. And second, we want to offer an understanding of how to remediate certain vulnerabilities so that they can continue with their scheduled missions with the knowledge that their ship is cyber secure.
So have we done anything new? There's a lot of software out in cybersecurity, and that is true in the Navy. So there's software such as VRAM, which will present cyber vulnerabilities on the C4I, or communication and network, IT networks on the ship. But there's no software which will present all the cyber vulnerabilities on on a ship-wide level to commanding officers and to technical people on the ship. So that's where our MVP will fit in. It will fill this gap where the software that is currently available does not accomplish. To the web application. So as Ross said, we need essential information. So the idea is we have a list of missions for the commanding officer. He can select one, for example, drug interdiction. It will show him a list of critical systems on the ship, whether HMNE, C4I, weapons, navigation, and then he can click on one. It'll present all the cyber vulnerabilities on the ship. But this is not random data. It's only the essential data that he or she wants to see. For example, what can it do? What equipment is impacted? Who's responsible? The commanding officer wants this to be fixed. So he or she needs to know who he needs to get angry at if something is still not being fixed. On an early version of our prototype, a former program manager at the Army Cyber Command came up to us after our presentation, our weekly presentation, and was like, "This is exactly what I was trying to do at the Army Cyber Command. This is exactly what we need. We need some sort of application which will connect which will bridge the gap between technical and non-technical people in the DoD." How much money can we make? I think a lot. So the DoD is very big, but the idea of how do we present cyber vulnerabilities to non-technical managers and people of authority is common across the private and public sector. So if we can create a solution for the DoD, for the Navy, it has a high potential of carrying over across public and private. So what will we be doing moving forward? Because we had some interest from different people, we plan on exploring what we can do and seeing what is possible and whether or not people will give us money to work on this. Of course, none of this would have been at all possible without the hundreds of people who have helped us, from people at MITRE to people in the Air Force, to people in the Navy, private cybersecurity, to our military liaisons, to teaching staff, to TAs, just everybody. We are totally indebted to people who have helped us. Thank you.
This is the last presentation.
We are Team Theia, a group of 4 Stanford students with backgrounds in computer science, policy, and business. Our Hacking for Defense sponsor is the U.S. Air Force 9th Intelligence Squadron aerial imagery throughout the U.S. Department of Defense. The 9th IS is responsible for producing insightful intelligence reports from film imagery, yet because of their lack of advanced automated tools, their analysts only ever look at 10% of the imagery taken. Currently, the imagery analysts look at positive film rolls through a magnifying lens on a light table, and this manual and cumbersome process means that they are unable to look through all images for objects of interest and may miss out on important insights. We propose an automated machine learning software for identifying objects and activities of interest in aerial photos. This system would allow imagery analysts at the 9th IS to save up to 70 hours per intelligence report, and more importantly, allows them to take advantage of the large amounts of imagery available. However, we realized through our interviews with the 9th IS and their clients that such automation software would also be helpful for many other stakeholders within the intelligence community, such as the NGA, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. After back-and-forth iteration with these potential customers, we have prototyped an imagery analysis tool with 3 main features. First, it allows analysts to upload and label image datasets containing the activities that they want to track, and then trains a convolutional neural network to identify such activities. Second, analysts can select a geographic area and timeline of interest to receive alerts when the target activity is detected. Lastly, it integrates with a database of existing geolocated reports to provide analysts with appropriate context. While similar software is already commercially available, the major players thus far have focused their efforts on large intelligence organizations like the NGA rather than smaller defense organizations like the 9th IS. By partnering with these smaller military organizations and addressing their specific needs, we have the support we need to successfully deploy our software.
Good afternoon. Hello? Hello? Good afternoon. We are Team Theia. My name is Chris, and these are my teammates, Minja, David, and Joseph. Our sponsor is the U.S. Air Force 9th Intelligence Squadron. As you saw in the video, our initial problem was to help the 9th IS deal with the large amounts of imagery that they get from their film camera and make better intelligence out of it. Over the course of the class, after exactly 100 interviews, we now have a much more nuanced and thorough understanding of the problem. We are aiming to develop a machine learning software for imagery analysis analysts to detect anomalous activity in aerial and satellite images in order to prioritize relevant geographic areas for further analysis. Over the course of 10 weeks, we learned three key lessons that we would like to share with you today. The first lesson is about knowing your customer. It wasn't until that we made it out to the Beale Air Force Base that we actually, and stepped in their shoes, that we actually understood all the problems that they were facing. The second lesson was about going deep. In the middle of the course, we were trying to solve so many issues at the same time that we weren't making any progress on one of them. It wasn't until we picked a specific one and really dove deep into one problem that we were actually able to make progress. The last lesson learned is about early wins. During our search for deployment options, we realized that there are a lot of customers that we could market our software to, but getting an early win and taking some small steps with our partner, or with our sponsor, for example, would be the right first thing to do.
So thank you so much. So like Chris just said, the first 3 weeks have been spent trying to understand our sponsor's problem. So we had a lot of interviews and meetings with many stakeholders at the Beale Air Force, but each of them had a different point of view on what was the problem. So we had many questions. First was, how does the 95S work? Then, who are the customers of the 95S? And finally, so what are the 95S problems? Luckily, using the mission model canvas, we could focus the discussion with our customers. But we had to make a lot of guesses because we had a lot of different answers. We understood that the only way to have the right answers were to go directly to the Beale Air Force and literally sit down with our customer and go step by step to see what they were doing. At the end of our visit at the Beale Air Force, so we were able to break down completely the process, the imagery process, going from the image collection to the analysis, to the dissemination, and finally to the use into the broader intelligence community.
And by mapping out the workflow, we were able to identify what were the key bottlenecks in the image analysis process. And I'll talk about 3 in particular in the areas of image development, analysis, and customer awareness. So the first main bottleneck was that the film development process took a really long time, and that limited the type of missions that the imagery could be used for. The second main problem was that these image analysts were manually examining the film, meaning that they could only cover a limited area of the image that they were developing. And then the last problem was that there was a lack of awareness within the greater defense community about what were the capabilities of the film camera, meaning that the film camera was underutilized. With a better knowledge of what was the workflow and what were the main problems, we sought to create solutions that would mitigate these bottlenecks. However, we wanted to solve all the problems, and we soon lost focus on how we could best contribute value to the 9th IS. So we went and made a number, or explored a number of MVPs, such as this scanner that would try and improve the processing rates of the film. We also explored the potential of creating software that would automatically identify objects and guide analysts towards key areas of interest. And we also explored the potential of creating a search engine for the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, which is one of the customers and holds the database for these images, so that image requests would be better matched with film camera when appropriate. So we had all these great ideas and MVPs and problems that needed to be solved, but we weren't sure about how to proceed, and we got stuck. But we weren't sure how to get unstuck. And it wasn't until week 6 when it really crystallized what were the decision points that we needed to make. So we called it the 3 layers of confusion to frame how could we proceed and what were the decisions that needed to be made. So first of all, we had to focus on what problem are we going to solve. Were we going to solve the problem of image discovery, or were we going to focus on improving the efficiency of analyzing images? Second of all, we weren't sure what product we were going to make. Were we going to take an existing solution off the shelf, or was there space for a new product? And then last, we weren't sure who was our primary beneficiary. We had this great relationship with the 9th IS, but we also wanted to have an impact on the broader intelligence community, and the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency was really in that position.
So peeling back these 3 layers of confusion required that we go deep in choosing one MVP or one issue to solve at a time. The first layer of confusion that we looked at was what beneficiary we should target. So the 9th IS was a natural pick because they're our sponsor, but they send all their images to the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency for analysis as well. And so what we realized is any tool that we would build for the 9th IS, at least for automated image analysis, would broadly apply to the intelligence community as a whole. Next, we've looked at the problem. We wanted to identify the exact problem that we wanted to solve. So we identified workflow issues at both the 9th IS and also the NGA. But most of the time, we were either hindered by the lack of security clearance to be able to talk more about them, or they were just one-off issues that did not scale. However, a recurring theme was just imagery analysts told us again and again that they needed tools for object identification and change detection. And so what they really wanted was some way of being able to identify activities in images over time. With our beneficiary in mind, the larger intelligence community, and also a much more focused problem, which is activity identification in images over time, we built out an MVP that had these features that we could actually test and get validated.
So now that we've achieved product mission fit, how do we get deployed? Right? The aim of the class, as Steve would tell us time and time again, is not to build a tech demo, but deployment. So how do we make concrete steps to get there? And we've discussed that actually we discovered that we needed early wins. We needed proof of concept. We needed to map our way there. And with that, we go back to the mission model canvas. So one of our key activity in such a product is to train a machine learning model. But in order for that key activity, we needed a key resource. And that key resource was simply labels of images. Now, labels of images of stop signs for self-driving cars wasn't going to be relevant to the intelligence community. So we needed labels of images relevant to the intelligence community. And to get that, we had to go to a key partner, which is our sponsor, the Knife Intelligence Squadron. And so we iterated on our MVP to show how this would look like. We wanted to leverage our partnership with the Knife Intelligence Squadron, and they've been super supportive and super helpful. This was a problem for them, as well as a problem for the larger intelligence community. And they, feedback that if this was an actual product, something, that was actually going to be deployed, then they were willing to put in some resources, and some of these resources were image analysts. So if we had 15 image analysts looking 2 to 3 hours a week, that would give us about 20,000 images in a few months, which is enough to train a very good machine learning model for this purpose. And so when we had our MVP, we also wanted to put in this idea that, okay, you can train and label your own images. And this gives the functionality and a feature that you are able to put in your own data sets. And if you have new data sets, which is important for, if you have new use cases that you might not even know about, then you have to curate the images yourself, and you have to label them. And so after analysts labels this image, we imagine that a machine learning model would train on these images, and this is how you would use it. Eventually, it would be a change detection software. We would detect changes in meaningful activity based on the labels through time. And because we wanted to make sure that this was integrated well into the image analyst workflow, image analysts would also be able to pull up reports and insights based on the area that they are looking at.
So we identify the problems, then we develop an MVP. Now the next task was to find how do we fund this problem, this product. So our team identified 3 funding strategies that we believe are most likely to succeed and will facilitate the deployment of the product. So the first one is SBIR. Why SBIR? Because SBIR has already one proposal that is aligned to the MVP that we have. Then we also identified the DIUX because this is a rapid procurement service from the Department of Defense, and they are working with a lot of government agencies. And finally, InQtel, because we believe that the product that we are proposing is differentiated enough and attractive enough to receive some venture capital funding. At this stage, unfortunately, there is no one in the team that is ready to have an entrepreneurship career. So myself, I'm going back to Canada. Minja, she's going into consulting. And Chris and Joseph, they are still undergrad. But there are a lot of resources at Stanford University, and we are really committed to support the 9FIS to find people and resources to develop that product. Finally, all we have done could not have been possible without the support of the 9FIS. So they've been incredible. They came almost every single week to the Stanford campus, and they facilitate the discovery process. We also want to support our mentors, the teaching team, and everyone else who has been involved in our journey. Thank you very much.
So that's it for this year. As we close out this session, I just want to remind you what you looked at was 6 student teams, most who never knew anything about the DoD or intelligence community, most who had no idea about the problem space at all, and all within 10 weeks gotten out and talked to 100 customers per team. This is a real testament to their effort, and we owe them our gratitude and a round of applause. And if there was ever a class that took a team effort, besides the teams themselves, I think they all mentioned, and I just want to repeat, they were all surrounded by a community of sponsors who gave them the problem, but dedicated mentors that worked with them every week, the military liaisons at Stanford, DIUX in Silicon Valley, and of course the rest of our dedicated teaching team, Jeff Decker, Steve Weinstein, Pete Newell, and the support of Stanford and Tom Byers and the rest of the department. For those of you who are watching online, thank you for participating. The videos of these sessions will be left online at the link you've signed in for, and we'll also make the PowerPoint presentations available as well. For those of you in the audience, there's a reception with food and drink. Please grab a name tag as you go out so we could know who you are. Exit to the right, and just exit to the door and just turn right, and we could all eat and celebrate the success of these teams. So thank you very much for coming.